On the eve of my university graduation, my boyfriend, Christian Black, abruptly ended our relationship. His words were cold and resolute. Kaya, in families like mine, love and marriage are separate. I must return home to fulfill my duty through an arranged marriage. Do you understand? With that, he handed me the keys to a villa, a Bentley, and a transfer of $5 million, calling them his farewell gifts to thank me for the past 4 years we spent together. I never imagined that just one day after our breakup, I would hear news of his engagement. When I arrived at the venue, there he was, standing on the stage. Dressed in a custom-made suit adorned with obsidian-like embellishments, he glowed under the lights, his striking features marred only by an air of aloof detachment. Then I saw her, the woman he was marrying. She was barely 1.4 meters tall, obese, and her face was covered in greasy, swollen acne, each blemish looking ready to burst at any moment. I couldn't believe it. My ex-boyfriend, the man I once loved, was going to marry her. Reflecting on last night feels like looking back on a different lifetime. When I returned to the villa after my internship, Christian suddenly pressed me down onto the bed. Leaning in close, his voice hoarse, he whispered in my ear, "Darling, you can ravage me like a beast tonight." What followed was an overwhelming lovemaking, as if he wanted to consume me entirely. The night was filled with heat and madness, so overpowering that I felt like I was drowning. Yet, when I woke up, he was gone, vanished without a trace. His phone number was disconnected. His Telegram, Instagram, and every other social media account had been deactivated. Just like that, he erased himself completely from my world. Still reeling from confusion, I was visited by his lawyer. The lawyer, arriving deliberately at noon to avoid disturbing my rest, explained that Christian had planned it this way. He handed me a document, and upon opening it, I discovered it was a deed of gift. "But Christian, I don't need your money." I had already told him about my family background when we were together, but he had only replied confidently, "No matter how wealthy you are, you won't be richer than me." I never argued back. I loved him too much to care. But last night, he was so passionate, so proactive, spending the entire evening professing his love for me. How could he leave so abruptly, disappearing completely the very next day? I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm, using my family's connections to quickly uncover the truth. Once I understood what was happening, I went straight to his engagement ceremony. On stage, Christian's expression was strained, his reluctance unmistakable. His gaze was hollow, as though he was shouldering an unbearable weight. As I watched him, an undeniable instinct surged within me. He was being coerced. Just then, someone in the crowd shouted, "Kiss her." The woman's plump hand reached out toward Christian, trying to grab his. He instinctively stepped back, avoiding her touch. Her face fell immediately, and she yelled, her lips quivering, "Did you forget what you promised me?" Christian's face turned ghostly pale. He clenched his fists tightly before forcing himself to step forward, his movements stiff and mechanical. My heart sank, and I couldn't stay silent any longer. Pushing through the crowd, I shouted at him, my voice firm and clear, "Chrissy, if something's wrong, tell me. Don't force yourself." In an instant, every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me. Christian froze when he heard my voice. For a fleeting moment, a trace of joy flickered in his eyes, only to be quickly replaced by a cold, guarded expression. "Who is this shameless woman?" his alleged fiancée snapped, her sharp voice laced with contempt. Calling Christian out so intimately. "What are you trying to do?" I opened my mouth, ready to reveal my identity, but Christian cut me off. His brows furrowed in disdain as he spoke, his voice icy. "She's just a pathetic, clingy stalker. Get her out of here. She's not worth our time." His words pierced my heart like a dagger. I stood there, motionless, staring at the man on the stage. The man who, just moments ago, seemed moved by me, now looked distant and indifferent, as if he were a stranger. The whispers of the crowd grew louder, a chaotic mix of mockery and scorn, yet I couldn't hear them clearly anymore. My vision blurred, and only one thought repeated in my mind. Christian must have his reasons. He must. I could feel the disdain in every gaze directed at me. After all, who would ever respect a stalker? But I'm not one. Christian and I met through a club activity in university. At the time, I had just started practicing Muay Thai, was starving, and ended up sneaking some snacks from my roommate. She teased me about it and even joked that I should call her mom as punishment. It was all in good fun between roommates and I didn't mind. So, I actually called her mom. At that moment, Christian stepped in and defended me. He said it was wrong to bully someone just because they were poor, but he also told me not to steal other people's food. He was the kind of person who always fought for fairness. After that, I began playing the part of the poor, helpless girl, constantly seeking his attention. Not long after, we became a couple, and before long, everyone at school knew I was kept by him. People would gossip that he was supporting me, this materialistic girl. In order to save face for him, I told him my family was actually quite wealthy. But he didn't seem to care. We were together for 4 years, and while our love didn't have any dramatic twists, it was sweet and deep. In fact, we rarely ever argued. So when he suddenly broke up with me, I couldn't accept it. I just needed to know why. I stare at Christian on the stage and slowly walk toward him. But before I could say a word, that woman suddenly appeared in front of me. She was so short that she had to look up at me, and I had to lower my head to meet her eyes. "You're still coming up here?" she sneered, jumping up and attempting to slap me. I stepped back to dodge it, frowning as I turned to Christian and asked, "You broke up with me to marry this? What nonsense are you talking about?" Christian quickly stepped forward and raised his hand to slap me. The woman's slap missed, but when Christian struck me, I didn't even move to avoid it. He had been sick recently, and I was afraid he might fall. Despite everything, I was still worried about him. How pathetic. I touched the spot where he had slapped me, my eyes filled with pain. The woman approached, sneering in contempt. "A materialistic tramp like you dares to act in front of me? Do you know who I am? I'm Michelle Miller, and my family is the richest in Atlantis." I didn't even look at Michelle Miller. Instead, I kept my focus on Christian. "You left without a word. This isn't fair to me." "Fair?" Christian frowned. "I've given you everything: money, assets, savings. What else do you want? Stop making a scene, Kaya. It's over." His expression turned cold. "You know how it is with my family. Love and marriage are separate. Thank you for the past 4 years, but my wife will only be Michelle Miller. Do you understand? I have just one question for you. Do you love me?" I looked at him and asked. As for marriage between wealthy families, I understood it all too well. My parents' marriage was arranged, but they were fortunate. They grew up as childhood sweethearts, and their love blossomed naturally. As for me, I was also supposed to have an arranged marriage, but it wasn't a necessity. My family's position in the capital was solid enough that we no longer needed marriage to secure our standing. "Enough, Kaya," Christian said, his tone cold. "I've known since I was a child that I would have an arranged marriage. I never believed in love. I dated you because I thought you were attractive, and honestly, because you were poorer and easier to control." He smiled mockingly. "Now that you've heard what you wanted, just leave." The deep affection I thought we shared turned out to be an illusion. In Christian's eyes, I was nothing more than a well-behaved, decorative, kept woman. How laughable. I nodded. If that's how it was, then so be it. My heart ached, but I could let go. I had come here hoping to salvage the relationship, but if that wasn't possible, I would walk away. I looked at Christian, forcing a bitter smile.
"Fine.
I wish you happiness." With that, I turned to leave the stage. Christian clapped his hands, looked away, and avoided my gaze. However, Michelle blocked my path, sneering. "You've come this far, so stay. Otherwise, you'll be disrespecting me, disrespecting the Miller family, disrespecting all of Atlantis." How arrogant. I smiled. I had heard similar threats before. The capital is vast and not everyone knows me, so some people try to act high and mighty. But once I dealt with a few of those types, no one dared speak to me like that anymore. Michelle didn't catch the disdain in my expression and instead clapped her hands. At her signal, Several men in black suits stepped forward and surrounded the stage. "You filthy woman," Michelle sneered. "As long as I'm not pleased today, you won't leave here." Christian rushed over, glaring at me. "Get out of here. I don't want to see you again." "Did I ask you to speak?" Michelle cut in coldly, her face tense. "You really think I'm blind? I can tell you're protecting this slut." "Protecting me?" I met Christian's gaze, noticing the concern in his eyes. Perhaps his earlier words were just a lie. Christian shook his head. "I just want to leave the past behind. Today is our engagement day. What does my ex-girlfriend have to do with this? It'll reflect badly on you, if this gets out." His voice softened. "Michelle, I'm considering you and your family's reputation." Michelle seemed somewhat appeased but still responded, "I don't care about losing face. In Atlantis, I'm the queen," she said, pointing at me. "Go down and watch the ceremony." I nodded, giving Christian a half-smile before stepping down. But no sooner had I left the stage, for men in black suits surrounded me and escorted me to a corner. Clearly, they were afraid I might try to escape. From the stage, Michelle spoke again. "You filthy woman. Just stay here and watch. If I don't want you to leave, you won't be able to. If you don't let me go now, wait until you want me to leave. I may not go then," I replied with a faint smile. "Shut up," Michelle snapped. I smiled but said nothing. If they wanted to play this game, then so be it. But they shouldn't blame me for whatever that will happen next. Michelle continued, "I heard you're from the capital. That's nice. Soon, some important figures will arrive, young heirs from influential families. I'll introduce them to you. It'll be a good opportunity for you to see the world." "Then I must thank you in advance," I said, unable to suppress a smile. At that moment, a group of arrogant young people approached. It didn't take long to recognize them as Michelle's friends. "Little slut, think your life is good? You really believe Christian will protect you? Let me tell you, even if you hadn't shown up today, Michelle wouldn't have spared you. How could she allow a woman who's been with her fiancé for 4 years to live? I have a phone. Want me to call the police for you?" The group laughed freely. I lowered my head and fiddled with my phone, uninterested in engaging with them. But there was one thing I was certain of. Christian was indeed trying to protect me. The engagement ceremony concluded swiftly. Next came the stage where guests dined, drank, and socialized. Michelle led Christian around, personally serving drinks to each guest, all of whom flattered her profusely. I took the opportunity to learn about the Millers in Atlantis. While they were indeed the wealthiest, they lacked depth and were considered nouveau riche. Their rise to prominence was due to connections in the capital, securing numerous major projects in Atlantis, which propelled them to the top. However, they never managed to infiltrate the city's aristocratic circles. In other words, today's attendees were either sycophants of the Millers or guests of the Blacks. The Blacks, on the other hand, was an old family in Atlantis, but had fallen from grace. The marriage between the Millers and Blacks was mutually beneficial. The Millers sought entry into the aristocratic circles, believing that marrying into an old family would grant them that access. The Blacks, however, was primarily interested in the wealth, hoping to use this alliance to revive their fortunes. Such marriages were common in my experience, so I wasn't surprised. Looking back through history, such alliances have occurred throughout the ages. Marriage has always been a strategic endeavor. At this moment, a young girl who appeared to be around 16 or 17 sat beside me. She was sweet and charming, with a hint of baby fat on her face, making her especially endearing. Her features bore a striking resemblance to Christian's. "I'm Jermaine Black, your ex's younger sister. From now on, don't speak and come with me," she said, her voice cold despite her cute appearance. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed my hand. I remained still and asked, "Did your brother ask you to help me?" "What do you think?" Jermaine replied, "Hurry up and come with me, or you won't be able to leave." At that moment, several men in black suits approached. Sighing, Jermaine released my hand and sat down, seemingly resigned, as she knew escape was impossible. "You shouldn't have come," she sighed again. "If it weren't for you, my brother wouldn't have had to marry that Michelle Miller." For me, I was surprised, But before I could ask further, I noticed a commotion in the banquet hall. Michelle and Christian walked towards the entrance of the banquet hall, signaling for everyone to rise. A group of young men and women entered, exuding calm and composure. At the forefront was a man in his early 20s who carried an undeniable air of authority. Michelle eagerly welcomed him and said, "You're finally here. This engagement party almost turned into a disaster without you." Michelle immediately stepped forward, extending her hand to shake his. Troy Davis, however, didn't take her hand, nor did he even look at her. Instead, he studied Christian carefully before asking, "Are you Christian Black?" Christian hesitated for a moment before nodding. Troy's demeanor softened a bit, and with a smile, he remarked, "She hid it so well. Otherwise, we would have met long ago." Michelle, mistakenly thinking he was referring to her, wondered when she had been hiding. But she didn't dwell on it and quickly turned to address the crowd. "Everyone, this is Troy from the Davis in the capital, the rightful heir. The Davis is also the Millers' strongest ally in Atlantis." The others immediately began applauding, fawning over him with eager enthusiasm. But Michelle's attention shifted to me when she noticed I was still seated on the sofa. Her eyes narrowed with anger. "You slut, who gave you the courage to sit there? Kaya, stand up now." All eyes turned to me, their smiles turning malicious. To them, since the heir of the Davis had arrived and I hadn't risen to greet him, it was a sign of disrespect, one that would surely be punished. I remained seated, calm and composed, and smiled at Troy. "Do I really need to stand up?" Troy paused, rubbing his eyes, then studied me once more. His expression shifted. Michelle, still smiling sweetly, said, "Troy, this slut is my fiancé's ex-girlfriend. To put it bluntly, she's just a pathetic dog. I left her here as entertainment. You know, I have a dog-fighting arena. I'm thinking of throwing this bitch to the hounds." Christian's face turned pale as he gritted his teeth and said, "Michelle, did you forget what you promised me?" "I did promise you," Michelle replied coldly. "I promised that as long as you married me, I wouldn't make things difficult for her. But since she came here on her own and humiliated me, why should I let her off?" Christian said nothing, but quietly walked toward me. He stopped in front of me, shaking his head with a bitter smile, his eyes full of affection. When will you ever stop worrying me?" I stood up and flashed him the bright smile he loved most. "Don't talk about me. When will you realize your woman is strong enough?" I took his hand and stepped into his embrace. He whispered softly, "Kaya, I'm afraid I can't protect you anymore. The only way for you to leave here now is to take me hostage. Then, take the money I gave you and run as far as you can." I smiled helplessly. He still didn't trust me. Had I hidden it too well? At that moment, the men in black suits moved toward me, but the banquet hall staff had already surrounded them. The men in black resisted, but were quickly subdued. Almost all of the Millers' bodyguards in the hall were taken down in an instant, causing shockwaves among the guests, who gasped in disbelief. Christian, bewildered, grabbed my hand and tried to pull me away. "Let's go." "No need to leave." I stopped him, placing my hands on his shoulders and gently pushing him back onto the sofa. I sat down in front of him, leaning back casually. My relaxed posture carried an undeniable authority. Christian stared at me in shock, as though he had never known me. In his eyes, I was always the bright, sunny, and gentle woman. He had never seen my sharp edge. Michelle, stunned, finally spoke. "Slut, are you seeking death? This is Atlantis, my territory." "I know," I replied calmly. "Christian gave you money, and you used it to hire people to cause trouble, right?" Michelle pointed to my people. An hour before I entered the banquet hall, my people had already replaced the staff here. There's an old saying, a wise man doesn't stand under a dangerous wall. Without preparation, how could I have dared walked in here so confidently? Michelle then turned to Troy and said, "Troy, lend me your bodyguards. I want to deal with this slut." Troy didn't respond with words, instead walking silently toward me and bowing. "Sister Kaya." Troy's voice was incredibly humble and respectful. The others he brought with him also bowed to me. I only smiled but didn't respond, leaving everyone stunned and speechless. Michelle rushed up to Troy Davis, demanding, "Troy, what is this?" Troy slapped her across the face in anger, shouting, "How dare you steal my sister's man? I came here specifically to deal with you." Michelle held her face, her oily complexion filled with confusion and disbelief. "The Gold family, haven't you heard of it?" Troy asked. Michelle's face turned pale, and she trembled as she asked, You mean Kaya is from the prominent Gold family in the country, and is the only heir of the Golds?" Troy coldly replied, "Yes." "What kind of family is the Golds? Are they that powerful?" Michelle asked. "You don't even know about the Golds?" Troy asked. 3 generations, with 7 people who've entered the cabinet." "What?" Michelle couldn't believe it. "Does Christian have a disease or something? With a girlfriend like that, why would he let others gossip about him?" Christian's expression also changed as the conversation unfolded. His face was filled with disbelief. I sighed helplessly. "I've told you many times how powerful my family is, but you didn't believe me. It doesn't matter now. I'm not going to say more. Since I thought we will get married, you'll eventually find out. Who knew you were so eager to protect me that you almost got played by a fool?" Christian blinked, still finding it hard to accept. I grabbed his hand and said, "You didn't even think about it. You're so handsome, with a great family background. Why did no one dare to pursue you during your 4 years in college?" Christian looked at Troy in surprise and said, "But didn't he just say you hid me well?" I replied, "They all know you, but no one would dare to interact with you without my permission. As for those who wanted to pursue you, I've already made arrangements to block them. The villa we live in was bought by you, but the maids, drivers, gardeners, and chefs inside are all my bodyguards. The school's janitors, even your dorm mates, are all people my family has trained since childhood." I sighed and continued, "Actually, I didn't tell you the truth earlier. Not only because you didn't believe me, but because I was afraid you'd feel the pressure. But I should have told you sooner, so that you wouldn't be threatened. And honestly, I didn't care about the blacks, so I didn't investigate much. Otherwise, Michelle wouldn't have caused any trouble. If you wanted to revive the blacks, it could be done with a word from the Golds. But now we're dealing with Michelle." "Michelle Miller, you're quite bold," I said with a smile. Michelle's legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees, continuously bowing her head, saying, "I really didn't know your identity, otherwise I wouldn't have dared." But as she spoke, there was a hint of resentment in her eyes. I glanced at Christian and asked, "Did she take advantage of you?" Christian shook his head and said, "I got you to sleep through the night, and I came straight for the engagement party. She didn't get the chance to do anything to me." I nodded and stood up. "Let's leave it for now. In high society, no one gets what they want by shouting and fighting." After leaving the banquet hall, we went to the Blacks' house. Christian's parents had already seen me at the banquet, but they hadn't said much. However, when I showed up at their house, they looked at me with disdain. But after they learned about my true identity, I could see that they were excited, though they controlled their emotions. Of course, I knew they were deliberately trying to appear calm to avoid being looked down upon. To be honest, I didn't care. The black status was so low that I didn't even bother to guess their thoughts. I sat in the Blacks' living room, facing Christian's parents, with Christian by my side. Troy and his people had been dismissed, and I didn't know where they went. In a calm tone, I said, "The Blacks wants to rise again. That's fine. I'll give you half a month." But suddenly, Christian's father said, "Actually, we want to enter the capital." "Really?" I raised my hand to interrupt. "Uncle, I understand your desire to bring glory to the Blacks, but you're trying to take too big of a step. It's easy to get burned that way. Take it slow. You need to take things step by step." He didn't say anything, but then he asked if Christian married Michelle Miller, the Blacks can immediately enter the capital. "You're saying the Davises is your connection, but how come the Golds are more powerful than the Davis, and yet you can't help my family like how the Millers can?" I replied coldly, "I'm putting it bluntly here. If the Blacks can't immediately establish a foothold in the capital, then forget about the marriage. No wonder the Blacks are struggling. This couple has no vision." I was about to say more when Christian grabbed my hand. He said seriously, Dad, Mom, our family can't integrate into the capital circle. Even if we use Kaya's family to force our way in, we'll still be looked down upon. We'll even be considered a burden, a weakness for the Golds. What we need to do now is to focus on developing in Atlantis. After another 10 years, we can try again to enter the capital. Are you teaching me now? His father angrily scolded. I'm your father. Christian got angry too. Dad, if it weren't for your stubbornness back then, the blacks wouldn't have been deceived and fallen from grace. Grandpa wouldn't have died. Why can't you learn from your mistakes? Then he grabbed my hand and said, let's go. They're hopeless, and we can't reason with them. This was the Christian I knew, decisive and always doing the right thing. On the way to the hotel, I asked him about how the blacks had been deceived. He briefly explained that there was an outsider who knew some people in the capital and tricked his dad into investing, promising they could break into the capital circle. The whole family opposed it, but his dad insisted, and they almost lost everything. Since then, his father had been obsessed with entering the capital circle. Entering the capital circle is an obsession for some families. But really, very few people can break through from the provinces and truly establish themselves in the capital. Every circle is exclusive, especially the capital circle, which holds the most prestigious resources and doesn't want anyone to meddle with it. But every year, people from the capital try to lure others in, like Troy, who targeted Michelle Miller's family. Looking at it now, Michelle Miller is the wealthiest woman in Atlantis, but her family is just a shell. Most of the money they made went to Troy. I had done something similar in the past. I shared these thoughts with Christian during the drive, and he listened seriously but remained silent. When we reached the hotel, as I lay in his arms, he said, Kaya, you're so different now. I feel like I never really knew you. You used to be like a child, but now you seem so knowledgeable. Which one is the real you? It's me. I smiled and continued. Well, when we're married, let's go back to my family's old house. You'll naturally learn everything. Christian nodded, but then shook his head. I'm not interested. I'm working hard now because the blacks doesn't have anyone to step up. But now that you're my support, why should I keep pushing myself? He was right, but I didn't mind. After all, I loved him. By nightfall, Troy sent someone to pick us up. We drove to the outskirts, where there really was a dogfighting arena owned by Michelle Miller. The dog arena was actually a pit for dogfighting. The reason we came here was because Michelle and Christian's parents had gone crazy and wanted to kidnap me to threaten my family for benefits. However, when Michelle's men tried to capture me, they were intercepted by Troy's people and brought here. I sat in the stands, facing the dogfighting ring. Michelle was thrown into the pit, bloodied, facing a tethered dog. Beside me, Christian's parents trembled in fear. I never expected them to be so foolish as to try to kidnap me. Christian was shaking with anger. What were you thinking? Even if you kidnapped Kaya and used her to enter the capital, I wouldn't let you off afterwards. If we used her to establish ourselves in the capital, and with you being the future son-in-law of the Golds, do you really think the Golds will put us in a difficult spot? Christian was speechless from anger. I patted his hand, calming him down, then turned to Christian's father and said, You may not understand how the top circles work. If you threaten my life, my parents won't hesitate to act. They'll bypass me and make sure the blacks are gone for good, even Christian himself. This may sound harsh, but it's the truth. My parents won't even spare Christian's life because they'll worry about him seeking revenge. I know I've made mistakes. Give me a chance, Michelle cried out desperately. But as she spoke, the dog's leash snapped, and her voice was cut off. I didn't let Christian watch what happened next. I stood up and walked away. Christian's parents tried to leave, but I stopped them. I looked at them and said, You better watch carefully and write a 10,000-word reflection for me. If it's not profound enough, you better stay alert. There are plenty of blacks left. I need to make sure they understand how to be my in-laws. 6 months later, Christian and I graduated. Then, we returned to the capital and held a grand wedding.